because there are plenty of people on the left that support Brexit as well. Even though they might be socialists or old school socialists, whatever, they still at least they want the control back in Britain, and that is at least a start. So, and I think that is why I think Brexit is the start of what we've seen around the West with this populism thing. It's really weird because Britain tends to be a country that is more of a, we're quite quiet on issues sometimes compared to America and other countries, but I think in many ways we lead the way. And I think Brexit is a great example of how we've actually led the way for the rest of the Western world to start saying, all right, maybe we need to do something like this. Yeah, so I mean, but that's why they're sabotaging it, right? Have you seen Jesus? They're making such a shit show of it. And I said this back in 2016, they would do it on purpose. They would make a shit show of it on purpose because
it was all a plan all along. You could totally tell. And, we know that these politicians are not going to be here, when the real change comes or anything like that. They're just puppets, they're pawns, all that other scheme and stuff. But sorry to interject. Let's get started because there's so much valuable content that is being spilled throughout all of us, and it's not being put in the record here.
Yeah. It'll be shit now. The next hour, we'll forget what we were talking about. We've already got the good stuff out of the way.
Yeah. Joking. Well, if you live it and you breathe it, it doesn't go anywhere. So, okay. Welcome to the podcast. This is Hector Combo, your friend from politicalscams.me. That's not the podcast I'm doing today, but I'm doing Divergent Point podcast with my friend Mark Malone. And we're delighted to have Michael Tsarion joining us on the theme of creativity. Now, Mark, I am so sorry that I botched that introduction, but I am very thankful that you were able to make this happen. So with that being said, Mark, what do you think? Where are we starting with this?
Thanks, Hector. Yeah, welcome, guys, obviously, to the third edition of the Divergent Point podcast. And obviously very glad to have my friend Michael on board. Obviously, Michael and I have been doing work together now for about a year and a half, or actually, I think it's almost close to 2 years now, on and off with some music. Of course, I've been on Enslaved a couple of times. So I really appreciate your time today, Michael. I know it's obviously you're a busy man, so thank you for coming on board. And obviously, we're going to get stuck into a few different subjects today, but mostly we're going to be talking about creativity, I suppose. So I know most of the listeners, Michael, are obviously going to know who you are. But if you could just give a brief introduction about obviously what you do, both musically and, of course, philosophy and everything else.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate being on. And yeah, I really enjoyed those ones we did together on music. They were based on, your assistance with the projects I've been working on, 4 of which are out now and 2 are still on the way. Nearly completed the 5th of the 6 projects. So it's pretty much nearly done, which is really exciting.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you continue to produce and, and that Mark gave you some good musical influence. And I'm just the type of guy to get right to the point, be very blunt, because like Mark said, you're a very, very busy person. So, Michael, what does it mean to create?
Well, that's an interesting thing because remember, there's creation in terms of writing. This is what comes to people's minds when they think about it. Or in some other form, like an art form, which doesn't use words at all. So right away, you find what I call a contrarium, right? Because if you look into life, then you find death. If you look into black, you find white. So, inner and outer. So there's always a contrarium is the term I use for this fundamental, right? It's not a schism. It's not a bad thing. It's actually known in philosophy as dialectical monism, where when you're looking at one thing, that one thing often calls up its opposite. And so in creativity, we've got painting, say, and then we got poetry, right? And sort of lyric writing will be the written side. And then you got the musical instrument. So does this lead back then to the right, left brain? And I think it does. So to answer your question, it's about a dialogue. Not between you and the world, but between the hemispheres of your own consciousness.
I'm very glad that you were very precise in defining it, because to create is a phenomena of the imagination, and it's a dialogue with the self. It's the underlying essence of who you are. And we get caught up in language, and there are so many various ways to use the power of the word and the power of the pen. But I'm very interested in a type of art that doesn't use words, and you're kind of alluding to it. And what type of speechless, wordless art are you referring to?
Well, I'm thinking of music because I'm in the middle of that problem right now. It's not a problem, but it's an ongoing. People listen to my fingerstyle material and go, oh, it's lovely, where's the words? And I go, then you haven't fucking been listening to it, because there's no words that could articulate what the music is doing. It's very deep, it's very evocative, and if you know how to listen, it's saying it all. Like, and like a great guitar solo. You're going to tell me that you need to explain Jimmy Page's solo at the end of Stairway to Heaven? I don't fucking think so, right? And if you do need that, it's all over, right? So when you don't write the lyrics and declaratively tell what it's about, then it's an endless process. I didn't even like to name the songs I had, because it conjures a vision, which can limit. It may not necessarily be my vision, and I was worried that it would limit the listener. So I've always told my listeners, though, hey, don't necessarily nail the track to the, be aware of that. And I think they're clever enough to do that. But see, other people know you're gonna always associate that song, which takes you on a whole other journey of the right brain, with the name. So we're forced into these kinds of things, but at the same time, you have to work with it, and you have to say, well, this is the way I think it's packaged and produced. I played the tunes for 30 years. I mean, there's some tracks on the new album that coming out that it was composed in 1992 or 3, and here they are for the first time being packaged. This thing is so full of these paradoxes and bizarrities. So you have to sort of go along with the flow. Don't so much direct the music as let it direct you. Like how I put one song beside the other, decided, in other words, what would be on each album. Those songs are a big mishmash. How did I pick the 15, 16 songs to go on this album, then the next? That was an art that wasn't really deliberate. Then I really turned on my right brain and said, I don't know how to do that. I don't even know how to name these tracks. So, and I'd labored with that problem for over 20 years. When it came to the crunch, look, you've got to do that now. The day has come where you're going to have to name them, and you're going to have to, put songs back to back that were never meant to be back to back. But now you're presenting them in a different form, under a different guise. They take on their own persona. And it's almost like each song, listening back to it, said, and just something in my brain without the conscious volition said, that one. You're like 1, 2, 3, 4. And I listen back now to them and go, how did that arrangement take place? So there is some supervening creative aspect that sort of expresses itself through us. So then what I concluded was that the whole creative process isn't really something volitional. It's something that we're being used as a channel by some higher muse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it illustrates a problem of human existence, which is limitation of language. We play language games, and it elicits that bias, that precondition. And again, not only language, but ideology. And you talked about, creating music, but without words. And it reminds me also of the mutual relationship between the self and the frequency of music, because the frequency also touches you. It resonates and entrains you with a specific essence. Now, Michael, what is it about this phenomena that is so captivating to the soul?
Well, as I said, it's because when you hear somebody else expressing themselves, and especially if it's good stuff, right? It's hitting you on a level that our rest of our world doesn't give a fuck about. Our world is very left brain, and it's probably even lower than that, right? But a really creative thing affects you on all 4 levels, right? It's physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. Now, obviously, a lot of things affect us on one of those levels, but to get all 4 together, then it's truly magical. And therefore, music is the closest. You can really start discounting everything else. Maybe the highest poetry works on that level, but obviously it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that it's music that ticks all those boxes. And well, so then I was just saying the musician has a hell of a task at hand, to make sure that his music sort of reaches you on all those levels.
Yeah, because I know that you're wearing the Priest t-shirt, and obviously I'm from Birmingham, and Judas Priest and Sabbath and all these guys are from Birmingham. And actually, I know Mike Exeter, who produced the Sabbath and Priest records from Solihull in Birmingham. He's a friend of mine. He was going to do some work with Taurus, but unfortunately, we didn't have the budget for it. But, and it's interesting when you listen to those kind of bands, when you listen to a certain type of, I would say it's not just metal, it's any kind of music, but what those kinds of bands really bring forward is that perfect mix, the perfect mix between the layer of the intellectual, the layer of the feeling. Because, if you listen to like certain kind of pop music, for example, it really just kind of attacks the feeling aspect, love, relationships, all that. And that's important. But I think with music like heavy metal in particular, and classical and folk music, it really attacks you have the structure, which is very clever. And listen to something like Tool, for example. It's so complex, it's so clever, but yet it's still rooted in passion. I think people have this idea, especially when they listen to certain technical music like metal, that it's somehow fallen off, it's become too complex. It's fallen away from passion because there's so much going on. But if you really listen to it, it's actually just because it has everything going on, and it has all of those elements within it. And I actually wanted to speak to you, Michael, about something I don't think that we touched on when we were talking on Unslaved, which is what the relationship is when it comes to psychological issues, when it might come down to neurosis or it might come down to depression. From your experience as an artist and as a philosopher and as someone who's obviously knows about psychology, how do you think that one impacts the other? How do you think that it directly heals some of those problems, such as neurosis or depression?
Well, I know a lot about that because I've studied it very deeply. Metal got me out of depression. And if I hadn't got out of the depression, probably nothing would have moved forward. I'm thinking here in terms of 86, 87, 88, that kind of that period where it was especially going to be, it's either going to work or it's not going to work. I'm just going to be a fan in the normal sense, or I'm going to be a fucking devotee. All right. There's a big difference. Well, I became a devotee because it got me out of that, the rut, and did so ever since, so then I looked into what it's all about, why that is. And it actually is much more somatic than it is psychic. We're a psychosoma, body and soul, a body and mind. But there's a huge element of the body's response to vibration that isn't known except to certain, experts. And in the subject we're talking about here, which would cover PTSD and things like that, you'd be amazed how few the experts are. There's still a raging debate over the matters about the parasympathetic, the role of the parasympathetic system. And it turns out that the parasympathetic has always been recognized as the healing, sump, the one that dispenses the oil that cools all the upper systems that are raging and ready to go absolutely ape shit when under stress. So the cooling oils and the cooling fragrances are, emanating from, it's like the sort of a deep emotional immune system is the parasympathetic. Now they've realized, the parasympathetic actually divides itself into two. They just thought there was the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now they've understood really recently, like since 2010, that the parasympathetic is itself divided into, what could be considered upper and lowers, right? So they're restructuring everything we know. But it just confirmed, when I read their researches, it confirmed what I knew, which is that the parasympathetic system of healing is vibratory. Like if you take it to the brainstem, the information sent from the upper realm to the lower is 20% of consciousness. The information sent from the body through the parasympathetic up to the brainstem is 80%. So the communicativeness is completely opposite than what they thought. This has radically changed, what everyone thinks about neuroscience. But it's confirming this idea that there's a voice in the soma. And I believe that that's where deep music is plugged in. And then reading up on these people, Paul Levine and others, they're saying that when somebody reaches the absolute nadir, probably just before suicide or whatever, but at least just agree that they've reached the pits of depression, of meaninglessness, let's say. Yeah. There is a moment that comes, I think they have a technical term for it, but I can't remember what it is. But it's when they reach the bottom of the bell curve, there's a flash. It's very much like the tower struck with lightning description in the tarot, which is one-on-one, to this point. There's a flash. And in that flash there's insight, in which the depressed person sees everything as it fucking is. They just released a headline this week in which they claim that depressive people are spot on. And they're right. When they do these tests about, random things. And the depressive person is so accurate, whereas all the other frou-frou guys, they're all fucking miles off, right? And this is what I'm talking about on the deepest level. So to answer your question, really, there is a parasympathetic direct connection to music. In other words, put it this way, in simple man's language, music is a kind of immune system. It's kind of an external immunity. You have your normal immunity biologically, but there's almost immunity, real immunity, especially on an emotional level, in music, in what we call music. And this is hard to look at. It's like an external immune system. So somebody whose whole system is collapsed, right? And it's not sustaining you. By sticking on a record, at that time it was Jethro Tull and Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. They were the primary bands that saved me, right? You're lifted out. You find wings where there are no wings. And it's almost like the logo for Led Zeppelin is Swan Song, you know, which is a man who's with gigantic swan wings. I mean, so appropriate that, because that music did indeed do that. You know, so it has this apotropaic effect. It has a cleansing and healing effect, to the point where I would say it actually constitutes an external immune system, if that makes sense to people.
It does, definitely. Let me interject here for a minute, because I want to open this up into very deep matters. You spoke of the left constructed reality. The physical dimensions of reality are left. They're based on ideology. They detach the individual. They atomize us. They make us feel distance and all that. Mark mentioned how this is met with pop music, and if you really look at it, the dark undertones and all the other, you know, symbolism that goes underneath it, I really find it very interesting about the spectacle of concert. If you, it's a magically induced project where you have this puppet playing around for the masses, and the masses elicit this great emotional reaction and then imbue this puppet with their power and energy and takes it away from their essence, their self, the inner being. And the issue that you mentioned about how metal rescued you from your depression reminds me of blues, how it is seen as soul food, a spiritual food. And if you know, we all can agree, I think, that blues is the progenitor, you know, it's the original metal. And the people who were speaking of it, I don't know if you would disagree or agree, but they were really depressed. They were really, you know, angry, and they had something really viable to offer to the message of people. So what I really want to bring into this conversation is, what do you think about, why is it that it, and I know the answer, but I want to know what your particular answer is. Why is it that our immune system is being attacked with these dark vibratory essences?
Yeah, well, I mean, God, that's huge, you know, that's absolutely huge. We're attacked on all sides. One's got to say it. It kind of ties into what I kind of said earlier, which is that although there's writing, if you boil writing back, it becomes images again, with letters being ideograms, then later phonograms. So if our essence of our consciousness is imagistic, like Mark said, imagination, or I think you said it, Hector, as well, imagination is the key, then the assault is primarily one of images, and I think it is. So in music, when you hear music, it's causing images in your mind, right? So when you look at the advertisements and the television and just the other shit that they force you to you know, conform to in the daily life, in the everydayness of everything, then that is kind of poisonous, you know, because nobody's asking your permission. You have to sit beside people you might end up loathing in school, but you're stuck with it, you know, just because the letters of your second name, you know, they're stuck there, you know. And you may have to be taught by teachers that you can't stand the very look of, or the smell of, or whatever, right? So, and here it goes, you know, even your family members may not like you, you may not like them. So there's tremendous mask playing. And in music, you get a chance to, especially in rock and blues, and that is to kind of shrug off of that and take on another persona. You can be Steve Vai, you know, you can be, you know, Robert Johnson, for, you know, so there's a whole bunch of sort of, they're slightly transgressive. We can get to that later, you know, because that leads into questions about, oh, these bands really satanic and all that nonsense. But let's just agree for this part of the talk that they're transgressive and they're iconic, but they still remain on that level heroic. So a great deal of the focus of listening to a band that maybe other people don't like because they're loud, or there's, you know, what's going on with this fuzzy guitar and all this, the parents don't get it, right? But the very fact that that's the case has a sort of a transgressive attraction. And you see, unless we were under assault, we wouldn't like that kind of music. Nobody would listen to Motorhead, right? Or a lot of those other kinds of bands, unless you felt irritated by something. And you may not yet be able to articulate it, but Lemmy does, right? So then you go, oh, now he's giving words to what I care about and what I dislike, you know, and then the next guy, you know, the next lyric writer and whatever, you're actually getting to hear about, you know, like say Saxon's Princess of the Night. Whoever would have thought of sitting on a railway station or on a hillside in northern England and writing a song about a fucking train passing by, right? So a person who's really frustrated and locked in, who's not meeting the world on its own terms, can listen to those lyrics and say, that's totally opened my mind. That happens to around me where I live. But I don't watch the sun rise, and I don't see the rain falling, and I don't check out, you know, the state of affairs. But these band members can open your eyes by their lyrics, saying that turned me on. That was passionate. I thought about history there, and by God, that alone can open up a massive, let alone go into some bands like Candlemass, where they're Swedish esoteric poetry and the Rig Veda. Do me a favor, right? My God, epic shit, right? But even on the local level, just listening to, you know, a fairly mundane band, so to speak, can open your imagination. But again, the point is, I don't think you'd listen to raw heavy music of that nature if there wasn't something, you know, that had been assaulted, that you felt had been stolen from you, and that you were angry about things. I really don't. So there's definitely a tie-in with the darker emotions, and I think they should be there, because if they weren't there, we wouldn't have had then, as an epiphenomena, metal, you know, in any shape or form, even the lighter metal or the really heavy stuff. I don't think people would be inclined to listen to it at all, unless you wanted to put the pedal to the metal, you know, and feel the wind in your hair and feel vital and alive and wild.
You know, it's interesting as well, because
sorry, go on.
Sorry, Hector, I just want to off the back of this point, something personal from me, because I've struggled with severe depression for pretty much all of my adult life. Now, this is a result of personal circumstance, things that have happened, as well as growing frustrations with things externally, for sure. And, you know, there's a song in a Tool, there's a Tool lyric on a song called Bottom, which says, shit adds up when you're at the bottom. And it sums up exactly what you said, Michael, about when you're really at that low point, that's when you can almost see things for what they really are. That is when you can look around and say, oh, everything's clear now. The cards are stacked up against us. We're in a situation which is somewhat like a prison planet. And heavy metal offers you, I suppose, like a cleaner room in the dungeon to at least experience that emotion when you're going through it. And I experienced that personally. It's why I got into it so young. It's why I started in bands when I was like 14 or 15 and have toured up and down the country. Or the UK, of course. And I think that's a very important thing. And I think maybe tying that into, I suppose, the greater thing as a whole. And you were mentioning there, Michael, about it sort of being like a response, that if the world wasn't like it is, then heavy metal wouldn't need to exist. And I think that's true. I think it's like it's a defense mechanism, but it's a creative one.
So it makes it clear in my head, both from your explanation, I want to have a synthesis so we can move forward and look at the big picture here. The big picture is the battlefield is the imagination. And the solution to the projection of our embittered, disappointed, depressed state of affairs is, you know, in the imagination. Everything else is basically projected upon that. And we do live in a left brain society, and the solution comes from a right brain imagination, free association. Keyword on free association. So I also want to add into this, as a person who not necessarily is a great fan of metal, but I appreciate it, I love it, I have a lot of different bands that I like. I also like to offer that metal is not the only particular genre that has offered this rebellion, but in a different, more poetic, more ambient, dark, apocalyptic sense, and that comes from neofolk and all that. But I don't want to get caught up on that. Michael, I want to ask you something very, very good in my view. It's a very good thing. See, the synthesis of the left brain and the right brain. As someone who has experimented as a shaman with different entheogens, I have noticed the effect where the right brain and the left brain get merged, and existence being music gets enhanced. Now, of course, I don't want to ask you anything personal that you're not willing to share, but what do you think about that? Have you gone through any experiences like that? And what has it done to your appreciation of music?
Yeah, that's not my area, because I don't do any kind of entheogens or drugs. But I can say that it was a drug to head down to Belfast town and buy my first guitar. It was a tremendously difficult process to do that. But when I got, it was a Blazer. It was an Ibanez Blazer. They're usually used for rhythm, 2 humbuckers, you know.
Yeah.
We didn't know anything about guitars. I picked that aesthetically, probably for the price, but it was a good buy. It was, you know, it was a fucking outstanding instrument, right? Bring it back, opened the case, and just sat looking at it. And from that time on, even when second, third guitars start showing up, and even the earlier, you know, much more primitive guitars that we had to start off with that were bought cheap, I just was aesthetically attracted to the shape, you know, and very much observed the fact that I couldn't take my eyes off it. You know, Segovia, the great classical guitarist, said that as far as he was concerned, that a guitar is one of the most beautiful things that a man has created. And that sums what I'm saying up. But then on a personal note, just looking at the thing's beauty before you even want to make music with it, right, is a huge piece of this. Now, somebody would say, right, well, guitars then are clearly phallic, because, you know, everybody chimes in. Hey, and they're not wrong. there is an aspect of ithyphallic symbolism to the guitar, but there's more to it than that. Some guitars look very feminine, as a matter of fact. So, you can also bring that to bear. But for me, it wasn't just so much that they were phallic. It was that they're a weapon. Apropos to what we've just said, I'm looking at a fucking weapon. That's why, Pete Townshend has gone on record to say that's why he smashed them on the stage. He smashed them over people's heads. He put them through the walls. He literally thought the same way, very consciously understood this. And ancient primitive man, when he first got a stick and a piece of sinew or leather and twanged away on it in the same way they beat the drum of an animal, an animal skin, how can anyone deny that there's aggression involved in that? And so the harp and the guitar, right, are really hybridized weapons who shoot musical notes is the way to look at it. But weapons can be for destroying in an evil way, but they can also be used for destroying evil. And so, when you listen to Manowar, when you listen to Candlemass or the heavier bands, Motorhead's Orgasmatron, it's very easy for me not to then fall into some imbecilic trap of thinking, this evil is satanic or loud or heavy. I understand that it's black arrows of death into the heart of falsity. And once you tell that to a person, they get converted, they understand it. And then you can substantiate that by many, many lyrics that also clearly are anti-war and for the good. There's just non-ending of those kinds of lyrics. And then most rational people will be immediately convinced. Yes, I see it. My prejudices are wrong, mate. I get it. This is fantastic stuff. I may not like it. I want to run out and buy the latest Iron Maiden record or something, but I understand it now. That, sets my mind at rest. But even if you were dealing with pop, the same formula basically applies. If you're dealing with blues, good blues, those notes are still, they're still chinks in the fence to let the light through. They're still passionate. They're still born out of passion.
And it's a real good reason why, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's a real good reason as to why Pythagoras and all his, occult schools kept that knowledge very secretive, because it is a very powerful mechanism to either destroy or to create many things. And, when you hit a chord, it resonates with another individual in a very deep crux. Now, Mark, what do you think about this as a musician, someone who has actually played in front of like a large audience? Can you describe that feeling?
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to mention on the back of what we were just talking about is I think that this is exactly why there's such an assault on creativity and music right now, because of the kind of conversation that we're having and the kind of things we've said. Look at what music opens up for people. People that are not aware of some global conspiracy or aware of even, political issues like Brexit or anything. And music can, like philosophy and all these things, can open an avenue up to you. But because music is, in my opinion, a lot more powerful, because it resonates on a much deeper level, because not everyone has the intellect to understand Socrates. Not everyone can read James Joyce and dissect the same stuff from that. But everyone can listen to Black Sabbath's War Pigs and understand that message. And I do think that is why creativity, and I would like you to come to that in a second, Michael, and give me your opinion on why, on what you think is going to happen with creativity in the future because of that reason and because of what the system is doing. In terms of performance, I remember saying this when we were talking on Unslaved, that I think that performing is one of the most vulnerable things that you can do as a human being, because what you do is you're putting yourself in a situation and you're making yourself open to criticism, to judgment, and in doing that you have a choice to sink or swim. And you could look at that as a metaphor for life in general, right? If you put yourself in any situation, you can move across the world, you can do this, you can do that. And I think when you're performing in front of people, you are making yourself vulnerable. You're cutting your wrists. You're dunking it out there in the open and saying, right, this is me. This is who I am. And that is very, very hard to do. It's a very, very tough thing to do, to sing. And I've performed for tens of thousands of people over the course of the last few years. And it's not easy when you get bad reviews. It's not easy when you know that people are not budging in the crowd and you know that you're not their cup of tea. But in doing that, it strengthens a philosophical resolve within you, because in doing that, you're forced to push forward when things are not going your way. And I really do look at that as a microcosm of the macro of the world at large. And I think that performing, if everyone could do it, I think it'd be worthwhile for everyone to do, because vulnerability leads to growth. You know, you have to kind of make yourself vulnerable in order to grow, because otherwise you're just protecting yourself from breaking down, burning off deadwood and starting again. And I think that's music is very good for that. And I think if you don't mind us going back to that segue there, I was wondering, Michael, what you think about that. Do you think that creativity has taken, because in my opinion, as a musician, I think creativity has taken quite a dip in the last 10 years or so in the public sphere. Do you think that that is somehow coordinated? Do you think there is something to the industry the way it is today, with all of their affiliates and all of the people that help control it? Do you think that that's calculated, or do you think that's just a result of the culture? And where do you see it going in the future?
Well, that's a real big question, because there's multiple answers to it. Mm-hmm. But just one point, you know, one of my favorite Irish musicians, Andy Irvine, literally said what you're saying, that it's like tearing yourself open in the middle and opening yourself like that to an audience, an open wound. Lisa Gerrard from Dead Can Dance has said things very similar to that as well.
Yeah.
But back to your point, you see, my first answer would be that man has changed, right? Although there are environmental reasons attacking creativity and talent and leading us down, you know, to mediocrity, which, as Conan Doyle said, knows nothing fucking higher than itself, right? The genius is disappearing because also man is suffering less. A few minutes ago, we spoke about depression, you know, authentic depression from authentic rational reason. Anybody could be neurotically depressed. Now, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when your life is fucking shit for real, obvious, external, rational reasons. See, from that then comes these healthy, displacement things like music. Music is a displacement and a sublimation for a person who cannot express directly. And often it was for the musician too. So there's a simpatico right there. But because man is not really authentically suffering, even his suffering has become pseudo. The music and the creativity likewise falls to a very perverse, disgusting, demented level. So there's a correlation between real suffering, the non-neurotic, legitimate suffering, you know, and oceanic experiences. Like a person who's just had a heartbreak will take that walk. He'll go on that headland. He'll strike out, you know, and want to be alone more, not head down to the fucking pub, right? All the noise and the chaos. So just by that same token, when you are either inspired, that creates creativity, or also when you're dead depressed and dead, suffering in something. This was brought out in the movie Crossroads, you see, and other points as well. And there's a kind of an aloneness tie-in there, right? Where the great music is written alone. It's not something you can really do, you know, with a whole bunch of guys. You can refine it later on. And there are, of course, exceptions to that rule, where a group like the Church will get together and they'll all jam in a very ambient, psychedelically surreal way. And then songs come out of that, you know, kaleidoscope. There are bands who do it that way. But obviously, most of it, it's a single individual sitting with their song because it's coming out of something that is meaningful to them. But just like Schopenhauer said, life is fucking meaningless without suffering. So there's a suffering music or suffering creativity dynamic, right? A correlation, which is missing today, because the urbanite today and the millennial doesn't suffer, at least not according to what I would call suffering.
Well, if you consider not having a like on your Facebook status, that's true suffering, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the main elephant that I want to tackle here that has not been mentioned is the casino algorithm, which exploits the psyche of individuals that are willful participants in plugging in their psychology into this and clicking everything and appealing themselves to the mob, which just exacerbates mediocrity, you know, appealing to the lowest common denominator to aggrandize yourself, and to, again, reference Schopenhauer and the idea of exposing yourself and being vulnerable. See, I like prose. I like to speak from the heart, and there's a little death and a little rebirth in everything. And in speaking up and being vulnerable, you're literally dying, in the sense that the old idea of who you were is dying and rebirthing right before the audience's eyes or yourself. But Michael, one of the main things that really, really keeps it all together and keeps people away from, you know, this satanic music, I really want to tackle that aesthetic. Why do you think that there is this perception that these long-haired evildoers are trying to play music? What's up with that?
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. Ronnie James Dio talked about it, you know, as being sort of a highly chivalric music, which means heroic. and casting back to a time when there were chivalric morals. And I buy into that. I think that's very much the heart of a lot of these guys who sort of cast their eye on the modern world and basically don't like it. And so as a protest against that, they'll grow their beards, grow their hair, and cleave to, masculine, heroic things of the past, riding horses, working with swords. Like I said, the guitar's a weapon anyway on one level. And, seeking that damsel who's in distress and killing that dragon. And it's fine. Why not? Back in the 80s, you had the phenomenon of Dungeons and Dragons, and half those people were the ones laughing at heavy metal 5 minutes before that. So, and then now country and Western guys are wearing ripped jeans, getting tattoos and earrings. You can't tell them from, take off the cowboy hat and you can't tell them different from a metal band. What the fuck is that, right? So it's almost like it's the whipping boy, right? It's like Aleister Crowley, all the Christians got to wheel him out every time they have no subject matter, right? So heavy metal is wheeled out by people, who really, I don't know, love the sound of their own voices, don't know a dick about anything, haven't read the bands, haven't read their lyrics, and I have actual physical proof of this. Growing up in Ireland, I've been confronted by extremists in the church, and I've confronted them, on the subject matter. So I've been going through this problem since the mid '80s.
I was going to ask you actually about that, Michael, and how you feel that the creativity is different in different parts of the world, and also how that ties into political situations in different parts of the world, or philosophical situations in different parts of the world. Ireland, Britain, for example, and then Europe and America. Is there a specific type of creative force, do you think? Do you think there's an essence that drives British and Irish musicians that might be different to Europe and America? Or do you think that there is a commonality amongst all creative types?
Well, no, there's a lot of bounce back. There's a lot of call and response. Every British band, from the Beatles to the Stones to the Kinks, will tell you that they were glued listening to American music. Mm-hmm. Then you go back over to America a little bit later after the Beatles came, and you'll hear them say, later bands in America were influenced by what was happening, down the line in England. This is absolutely factual. So there's definitely a call and response. But remember, the kind of music we're mostly talking about, you have to go to the level of subculture, because it's not that each country then has, a particular focus or expression. It's subcultural groups, like say in the Nordic countries. You got the black metal guys, and not even black metal, but just harder metal. Yeah, but they're very akin to what's happening in Britain as well. So amongst all these subcultures, you go to Croatia. Iron Maiden was absolutely massive. The Moody Blues were big in Russia. I think one of the first bands to ever go east of the border. So there's a certain sound, the electric guitar, which to me, when you talk about rock, even the lighter bands can have a more metalish edge, and some very, very heavy bands can have a very light sort of balladic type of thing. It's all based on the the usage of the electric guitar and that sound and how it's used. That really, for me, distinguishes a rock band from any other kind of band, right? And what that means is that some fairly light bands can actually be described as metal, believe it or not, and then very sort of metalish bands cross the border backwards, and can be almost considered folk bands like Led Zeppelin. It's crazy. But when you're dealing with subcultures, there's something about, that. And of course, somebody says, all the hippies and all, and then later came this group or that group, or later came the mods. But say like in the Who, you see that where they start off as fairly lighter mod music and then become practically metal as they progress. Even Roger Daltrey growing his hair out, looking like a simulacra of Robert Plant. In the end, you can't even tell the difference, right? So there's a tremendous experimentation. So I think that what happens is that the signs of independence, something out of reach about the guitar. The first time you saw one was through a window and it was way overpriced. You could not get it. So in something heroic by going and attaining it, very much as Mark Knopfler talks about his relationship with the Fender Strat, but other members as well. The fact that you've earned your money with that in focus, then after getting the guitar, now it's getting that record deal. Then after getting the record, it's the record. After getting the deal, it's the record, and then fame and all the rest of it. There's something very addictive about that, especially for people who feel lost, who are disempowered because other people have crushed them, and who are of a depressive mindset. But depressive is a synonym for poetic and sensitive as well. So it's a mixed bag. But it's not so much about what the culture in general thinks. It's more about what these individualized, subcultures are about.
on the modern world, which is a very important thing you mentioned about the social dynamics and subcultures and individuals going on a quest, becoming heroic and meeting their shadow self and synthesizing, self-actualizing, all that is an individual's quest for meaning. And in the social dynamic of, I mean, I've traveled to Birmingham, I've traveled to England and all this other stuff, and I've noticed that everything is a lot of the same. And it's the Borg system that is trying to consume and assimilate all these disparate subcultures that are trying to empower themselves through music. Because in a real sense, music is power, which breaks the conditioning that is befallen on humankind by, you know, shadowy people, all these other types of influences. But Michael, talk about a little bit more on the issue of going on a quest, becoming heroic. In metaphysical or philosophical terms, what does that actually mean to you?
Oh yeah, well, it's a partly natural evolution, maturation of a psyche, and a girl or a boy. They become masculinized as they have to negotiate the reality principle. It's mostly a natural thing, but when it becomes conscious, then you'd be into the philosophy of it, like an Ayn Rand, where you now actually embody it. You're actually consciously aware that you need to be heroic. And so for me, that is indeed calling a spade a spade. In Randian terms, it means facing evil, calling evil evil, so that you now know what good is. She was always trying to explain that by fudging it and not being able to call evil evil, the next step in culture is that you no longer know even what good is. And she was 100% right. On a deeper level, she spoke about something existentially monumental, so controversial that I don't think hardly any minds in the world can download this without a lot of reaction. And that is that she said that her philosophy, a philosophy of selfhood and heroism, was based in freeing man from man. Well, that's the end of that. There's the demographic, divide right fucking there, because nobody even understands what that means and couldn't think of it, even haven't even formulated in their mind that it's a problem. In other words, the collectivistic mind isn't aware that there's an alternative to their collectivism. The oblivious person is oblivious of their obliviousness. They're in denial of their denial. But somebody on a fundamental level, say on an emotional level, gets it. They're more likely to become the kind of musicians we're talking about. Doesn't mean that they're able yet to verbally speak about it, right? In a way that, say, a Rush would have done, and various other bands. They were more explicit. Other bands know it's on an emotional level where they've understood that the Anglo-Saxon spirit or whatever, the spirit of the West, is just a symbol of being independent. And of course, it's with other races as well. And that is what it's all about. So it's a journey in which you continue to move towards individuation in whatever culture or background you're from. And that's always a very sage-like being who's okay with aloneness, who can bring meaning from within, who doesn't need to constantly be surrounded by other people to give them meaning, unless that person shares exactly the same values as they do, in which case that's a proper relationship. But what it really boils down to is this: that we have in the West forgotten one vital fact, and that is that you can have, like Victorian man did, like earlier man did, relationships with other things than just fucking humans, and this includes animals, inanimate objects, and instruments. And so today, what's also missing, and why the music is totally crap, is because there is no such relationship with the instrument. It's just something you buy in a store, pick up, go home, plug in, and impress people with. It's nothing to do with the spiritual journey you're talking about. Getting an instrument was like, in those days, getting a book or being handed something, even precious. People treasured that for the rest of their fucking lives, right? A little book, a little diary was considered, oh my God, today it's like nothing. So there's been such a devolution in terms of creativity and sensitivity. But actually, as a matter of fact, inanimate things like pots and beautiful antiques and even a watch, and another, anything it could be at all, anything. The more sensitive you are, the more it'll be, something quite trivial, as a matter of fact. But those things are kept as personal heirlooms, personal relationship. And so the greatest one of those personal relationships with an inanimate thing is a man's relationship with his instrument, with his musical instrument.
That personal relationship with reality is, in essence, bringing us back to the original point. And you mentioned, the idea of collectivism in the Randian sense. And if you read the novels, some of the individuals who were in collective, they did not have a personal relationship with reality. They had a personal relationship with the phantoms in their psyche. And that is the point I wanted to add. Sorry to interrupt, Mark. What were you going to say?
That's no worries. I was actually just going to obviously agree on the back of that point, but sort of looking at it from both a personal, so micro and a macro perspective, I looked at getting my very first guitar, which I washed dishes for £3.75 an hour. So just over $4 an hour when I was 15. Obviously grew up very poor, and that was a massive achievement for me. And I used to practice on a beaten up old guitar so I could buy my first guitar, which was still super cheap, but it was like Excalibur to me. It was like pulling the sword from the stone, like you said. And there is something much more fundamental than just music to the source of what we're talking about. And it is that Carl Jung hero journey, I suppose. It's the idea that you actually do have to venture out to do something heroic if you actually want to exist in the world other than how everyone else exists. And I think that was actually the fundamental essence between why so many of us actually become musicians. Yeah, of course, success is important because we want to reach people musically, but ultimately it was about going out and doing something that we knew not everyone could do. We know not everyone can stand on the stage and play a guitar like Jimmy Page and write lyrics like James Hetfield or whatever else. So and there is something fundamentally heroic in that, and I think that is an attack at the culture that we don't actually see right now. I think there is an attack at that element. We do know that masculinity is being attacked, of course, across the board in the West. And I think, like you were saying earlier, Michael, maybe that is actually directly impacting music because of that. Maybe it's not the music that's being attacked, it's the heroic element within man himself that's been attacked, and that has of course had a knock-on effect with the music and the arts and everything else. So that's really all I wanted to say about that. But I think that's a very profound thought, and I think that maybe we should all meditate on that one and hopefully bring more of that out in people so we don't lose art. Because what is the future going to look like if we lose music the way that it was 20 years ago? It looks bleak. I suppose my segue to that would be, what is the point in sorting out all of these political issues like borders and national sovereignty and all of this if we don't have any creative human essence left? Mm-hmm. All of those other things are meaningless.
Yeah. What's the point of breeding children if in the end they're just big fat couch potatoes without a brain cell? See? Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's going to be changes. You asked about that, and it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse and worse and worse because even astrologically speaking, there's a lot of deconstructive energy, an apophatic set of energy that people just do not know how to work with. They look at deconstructive energy as destructive. So they're right off the bat haven't learned the holistic paradigm. You see that this is good, this is healing, this is tribulation and catharsis. They don't know that, and they would fucking know it if they listen to more bloody metal, because metal by definition is very cathartic. It's mood altering, and when you really understand what mood is, my God, right from the German philosophical tradition, for instance, then this takes on a massive meaning that moods lie deeper than the rational structures and affect. Right, so it's almost like the upper antenna is very sensitive to the the ocean of mood that's lying below. They call it Stimmung in German. And music is an expression, not of your upper centers too much, unless it's Bon fucking Jovi, and even then, right? No, the real metal, the real stuff is expressing that mood-based, which is fundamentally philosophically. Can you believe it? So rather than being something superficial and ridiculous, although you have that, and that's okay. You got ZZ Top, and you got Motley Crue or whatever, and every so often it's good to have coffee beans to clean the palate and just listen to that. I listen to very easy pop or easy music just to, for a moment, clean the palate, because you can't be steeped in the heavier stuff. It loses its fragrance at that point. In order to come back to it fresh, you have a hiatus point where I'll listen to blues or classical or something else, and come back. But you're quite right. Like we said earlier, the right brain is not being expressed. There's a definite assault on it, and so music is going to be one of the last relics, last means by which, and also using authentic instruments. I'm a big favor of digital music, but again, provisionally, because I know that if you go too far towards the digital editing side of it and synthesize music, then you're not actually playing with the instrument. Like I recently got myself a fretless bass. People are telling me, yeah, man, but you could just use regular bass and then digitize it into the fretless later on. I know, but I want the real thing in my hands, because just for extremely creative reasons, I want to create more with it. And I want to really feel the thing and get chops together with a fretless, and so I'll do that. But pre-digital, and use the digital later by all means. but have enough instruments around to have the real tactile thing in my hand, so that, you know, real creativity isn't chopped off, you know, or truncated.
Most definitely. And we talk about the darkest before the dawn. You know, the self-actualization comes after that, this deconstructive, that Armageddon, the revealing of the mask. But people are so attached to their ego, but that ego is not necessarily a relationship with reality. They're attached to these concepts, these phantoms that somewhat blind them to the reality. But Michael, I really appreciate where you're coming from. What is the last word on creativity?
Well, there was at the NAMM festival recently, a guy went around with a microphone and he asked, you know, Jeff Loomis and the guys from Korn, or guys from, you know, Tool. Yeah, he asked everyone he could meet that was famous, give me, in 3 words, you know, give us some advice about how you can become a better player. And they all gave their 2 cents. And it made me think what I would say. And your question does as well. And my response to that is always learn to listen. So in all creativity, right, especially in music, my message is, because I've done it, is, you know, anything I'm doing on musically is because I've listened to the Andy Irvines and the John Ranborns, you know, and the Tony Iommis, and I really listened. I mean, really, really listened to what they're doing, how they mix their music, you know, if and when they change instrument for some fucking bizarre reason, you know, alternating between guitars, or especially tempo changes. I think my music has a lot of tempo changes, I've noticed, when I stand back from it, because of the influence of people like that, or say, you know, Will Sargent from Echo and the Bunnymen, and Marty Wilson Piper from The Church. This constant alternating, you know, of guitar sounds, playing heavily on one string instead of doing a lot of other stuff, holding and lingering on the string and making sounds out of just one string, and really getting into that, you know, and constantly listening. And so rather than producing in some sort of a ultra yang way all the time, it's really about taking in impressions. You know, when you look out to something beautiful, it's giving you back immediately. You're not taking from it, it's offering to you. No, we don't think that. We think, I look out, I get something from nature. I got something from that sunset. I got something from looking at those leaves or those running horses or whatever. No, that phenomena gave that vision to you. So if you remain open, and then what we need to do is widen and widen that perspective and become more and more receptive to what's out there. And then nature gives us more. And then what we do is we turn it around again and represent it, you know, the conceptual back into the perceptual. So it's moving from the perceptual to the conceptual, and then the conceptual has to disgorge, as it were. And it is a deep circularity in creativity between letting something, you know, consolidate and amalgamate, and then turning it back to the world in whatever creative way that you choose. That's the freedom part that Mark was talking about. You're free to choose what form to present your expression in.
Thank you so much for for that wisdom. See, earlier in the morning, Don, an owl visited me. This is not something I'm saying poetic. It literally happened. Okay.
Right.
And it just elicited this response in my head, thinking, this is wisdom presenting itself in the darkest dawn. And here we are, presenting ourselves in the darkest dawn and presenting wisdom. So, Mark, do you have any last thoughts to add?
Yeah, I just have to echo those sentiments, because I know this from experience, that this creative journey has literally helped me survive through things that could destroy a lot of people. Things that I wouldn't get into, but it's been a very hard road. And creativity has not just helped me survive; in fact, it's helped me thrive. It's helped me find that heroic part of myself, like we were saying, like pulling Excalibur from the rock. So I would just say that I think I'd implore people to find that part of yourself, whatever form it comes in. And I'd obviously just like to thank you, Michael, obviously, for joining us today. You'll come back, hopefully.
Yeah, that's great.
And we'll discuss more on this and maybe some other topics as well. But
you guys are just
so much for your time.
Yeah, you guys are just, I really love this. And I like to talk on this level. I don't get often chance to do it, especially with people who know what the hell I'm talking about. Hector, thank you so much, Mark. Let's do it again for sure soon. All the best.
Will do, Michael. As long as you enjoy the conversation and it brings value to your personal life, that's all we're here for.
Oh, and obviously, guys, jump on to unslaved.com and be a member.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Cheers. Hope you have a nice day.